Hello. Welcome to part 2 of Nancy Holt, Massachusetts. I'm Rebecca Uchill. I am the curator of the exhibitions in both venues of our 2 CVPA galleries. And I am so delighted to welcome you all to this opening reception and very special discussion for Nancy Holt, Massachusetts. I too am going to take my mask off while I say hello to you all. We have so much to celebrate today. We are having such a wonderful series of discussions between colleagues, friends, enthusiasts, and maybe new converts to the work of Nancy Holt. And we're also seeing the return to UMass Dartmouth and New Bedford for some artworks and objects that are on view in the gallery down the hall. This is only possible due to the generosity of many entities, among them the Luce Foundation's American Art Program, Holt-Smithson Foundation, the Ladue Center for Civic Engagement, and the CVPA Dean's Office, and I want to thank you all for your support. Thank you. Above all, we are celebrating artist Nancy Holt, a major figure in 20th century art and an innovator of art and ideas across genres and disciplines. Attention to Nancy Holt's brilliant life and work is surging. Like so many women artists and practitioners, the resounding attention comes delayed, in this case after the end of her life. At UMass Dartmouth, we have the good fortune of living with one of her most personal artworks, Spinwinder, which sits at the entrance of our campus, and for which we see this beautiful model on view center stage in the galleries and gifted to us from the Holt-Smithson Foundation, for which we are so grateful, and we will be enjoying and working with this material for every semester I'll be teaching here, and I think many others as well. Thank you. Spinwinder makes reference to Holt's family history as well as regional histories of textile manufacture and education. Holt's grandfather, Samuel Holt, whose 1920s designing notebook you see behind us here and is on view around the corner. Samuel Holt was the head of designing and weaving at the New Bedford Textile School, one of the predecessor institutions to UMass Dartmouth. It is among the works on view in the exhibition. I also want to note here that when DeeDee and I spoke about Nancy Holt over the summer, she was remembering that Nancy Holt was very interested in the kind of algorithmic programming properties of the Jacquard machine, which does need to be programmed, as you can see, like a computer. Maybe we'll hear more about that today. In preparing for this discussion, DeeDee Halleck also sent me these images of regional advertisements for bobbins, shuttles, and spools, which are reminiscent of those in our archival collection, and which became the basis for Nancy Holt's spool forms in Spinwinder, as well as materials that are embedded within the foundation of the sculpture. And that's a history and legacy that's chronicled in the exhibition here and in the brochure that we've produced in accompanying the exhibition. Holt also made artworks not only about her grandfather and who resided at 39 Locust Street, but also about her aunt who resided at 39 Locust Street and about that home. These artworks, Underscan and Ransacked, tell a very specific and personal story, a story that's kind of a narrative portrait of the life of Aunt Ethel, a life that had real tragedy and hardship in the final years. These are documented in Ransacked, which is on view in the University Art Gallery. Well, that's a very specific and personal story. It's also a very New Bedford story, and it's a story that extends beyond the pages of this book. I want to recognize Louise Herman, who came today, whose father is one of the protagonists in that book, and thank you so much for being with us. I also wanted to ask if anyone from the Martinez family is here today. The current occupants of the downstairs apartment at 39 Locust Street, which have also been very generous in welcoming me into their home. We will hear a lot more of this story today. I want to recognize the students of ARH 390 and their hard work in particular, but also against the backdrop of the many people to whom we are indebted for their hard work on this exhibition. Thank you, everybody. ARH 390 students have asked me to remind you that they are conducting a visitor survey of your experience today. Go online to this URL to fill out your success story about today's event. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to our evening program of discussants. DeeDee Halleck is a media activist, founder of Paper Tiger Television, and co-founder of the Deep Dish Satellite Network, the first grassroots community television network. She founded the television version of Democracy Now!, an alternative daily newscast. She's professor emerita at the University of California at San Diego and was a trustee of the American Film Institute, Women Make Movies, and WBAI-FM. Halleck is an official representative of the non-commercial users constituency of the Internet Corporation, the official regulatory body of the Internet. Her book, Handheld Visions, is published by Fordham University Press. Halleck has received 4 awards for lifetime achievement: the Association of Independent Video and Filmmakers, the George Stoney Award from Alliance for Community Media, the National Alliance for Media, Arts, and Culture, and the Dallas Smythe Award from the Union for Democratic Communication. Halleck has worked with many artists, helping them with media performances and productions, and it is within that context that she first met Nancy Holt, and they became best friends. Lisa Lefebvre is a curator, writer, and editor. She is inaugural executive director of Holt-Smithson Foundation, an artist-endowed foundation dedicated to the creative legacies of Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson. Previously based in the UK, Lefebvre was head of sculpture studies at the Henry Moore Institute, a center for the study of sculpture, where she directed a program of education, research, publications, and exhibitions, as well as the development of the Leeds Sculpture and Collection Archive. Prior to this, Lefebvre taught on the postgraduate curatorial program at Goldsmiths College, London, led the contemporary art program at the National Maritime Museum, and was course director of the postgraduate program in arts policy and management at Birkbeck College, University of London. She has sat on juries for major activities in contemporary art, including British representation at the Venice Biennale, and co-curated the quinquennial, is that what every 4 years, it's happening periodically, and it's 5 years, quinquennial exhibition, British Art Show 7 in the Days of the Comet. She's published widely and spoken at art museums and in academia internationally. She is a prolific writer and author of many texts, including on her 2 ongoing research topics, the relationships between sculpture and prosthetics and the role of productive failure. Amazing. Ardele Lister came to filmmaking when she co-founded the Vancouver women's collective Real Feelings. Real Feelings produced Headache, a 1-minute spoof on pain medication, and So Where's My Prince Already, a 20-minute tragic comedy about love and marriage, both of which Lister directed. Lister's works have been exhibited internationally in festivals, galleries, and museums. They are in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Centre Pompidou, the National Gallery of Canada, the Stedelijk Museum, Kunsthalle Berlin. Lister was among the early artists to work with digital technologies with many groundbreaking works. In 1977, while working at the Foundation for Independent Video and Film in New York, she founded and edited The Independent, the first monthly publication for independent video and filmmakers. Prior to that, Lister founded and edited Criteria, a critical review of the arts based in Vancouver. She's taught at SVA, Montclair State University, and is currently a professor emerita in the Visual Arts Department at Rutgers University. Lister met Nancy Holt in Vancouver when Holt came to shoot a video, Revolve, with Dennis Wheeler, a good friend of Lister's. Holt stayed with Lister, and Lister also assisted with Holt's film project, Revolve. Lister stayed with Holt in New York, which was the start of their close friendship, and Lister lived with Nancy Holt for a brief period of time in New York City. Holt got a call from her aunt's lawyer, strongly suggesting a personal visit to her Aunt Ethel. Nancy Holt asked if Lister would join her, and that trip is one of the stories that brings us here and brings Ardele Lister here today. Ardele Lister and Nancy Holt's experience was memorialized in Nancy Holt's book, Ransacked. After today's discussion, we invite questions and a further look together at the exhibition. For now, a warm welcome to our esteemed guests, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for such a warm introduction. And maybe what's even more important than those slightly frightening biographies that you've just read of the three of us is that we are all joined by an intense commitment to the artist Nancy Holt. I mean, Nancy Holt is an artist who recalibrated what art could be, where it could be found. And as Rebecca said, she so often starts with the personal, but it's an intensely political, sociological, critically engaged body of work that she's making. And I have to say that from all of us at Holt Smithson Foundation, our thanks are immense to every single person in this room. What we are doing today is expanding Nancy Holt studies. So that means that we are thinking together to make the future of art history. And this thinking together, that's what this final session is really about. And often, I think we all think, well, how do we produce ideas? How do ideas come into being? Well, they come into being through research, through thinking, through experience, through knowledge of experience and experience of knowledge. But maybe even more than that, they come into being through exchange, through testing ideas, through going down blind alleys, through saying ridiculous things, and suddenly finding out that they've got some kind of traction for developing new ideas. And two key people who Nancy Holt thought with are sitting with us today, Ardele and DeeDee. Long friends, long interlocutors, and people who are really fundamental to this amazing body of work. We're here really where Nancy Holt began, in Massachusetts. It's a return while we're thinking about the future. And I'd like to start off our conversation, and it very much will be a conversation. And I need to just add in one caveat. We three can talk for not hours, for weeks, non-stop. So Eden is tasked with throwing things at me to get us to be quiet when it's the right time. But to start this conversation, I want to turn to Ardele, and your conversations with Nancy Holt are so important. And there's one specific one I want to talk about in a little while. But maybe we should start really with an interwoven beginning, where you first met Nancy Holt and what those conversations were like, and really why you decided, or why Nancy chose as well, for you to be the person to come to this place in November 1978, to come back to Aunt Ethel's house.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been an incredible day so far, and I've really just taken in with a great deal of pleasure and humility and admiration all the things that have been said by others so far. It's really quite special to have a whole day devoted to one person's work and to have different perspectives on that one person's work that you can then, think about. So I'm already thinking in that way you were describing of exchanges and conversations. I'm already thinking about ideas that came to me while, other people have been speaking earlier. And I think so much of these kinds of relationships that turn out to be very formative in one's life happen in a way by chance. I mean, you could say the universe has its way of putting people together, etc. But I was very good friends with Dennis Wheeler. We were in the art history program at the University of British Columbia together. And we had both kind of expanded our practices from just being art historians and, in a way, critics of contemporary art in Vancouver, which was a very happening place at the time. There were a lot of Americans, because of the Vietnam War, who found their way to Vancouver, both deserters and draft dodgers. And so my university education was really informed by the points of view of these Americans who might have been my faculty members or, friends in the program. And both Dennis and I, sort of separately and sort of together, had started to move into film production. He was working with Terry McLuhan, the daughter of Marshall McLuhan, and very excited about that project. And I had started this women's film collective, which was an outgrowth of the first International Festival of Women's Films, which was the major components were in New York and LA, but there were sort of minor festivals in San Francisco and Vancouver and various other places. And so, our worlds were expanding. Dennis got a Bolex. He was, so excited about having a camera to shoot with, etc. We, in my collective called Real Feelings, we bought a black and white, so-called portable video rig, but in those days, you had the giant sort of recorder apparatus connected to the giant camera, connected to the color adapter, connected to the power adapter. So the idea that you could now shoot video with your iPhone, which is truly portable, had not yet even been, a tiny thought in anybody's mind. We were thrilled to have this portable equipment. And so when Dennis was diagnosed with I think lymphoma at a very young age, he was in his 20s, and when Nancy found out, she was very upset about it, and she decided she wanted to do a tape of Dennis when he was, I think, briefly in remission. And he asked me if she could stay at my house, and I said, sure. Dennis and I live very close to each other. And then he asked if I would help with the project, because she had 4 cameras that, if you've seen the work, kind of rotate around the subject. And so I said, sure. And so between the actual project of filming Dennis and her staying with me, we got to know each other and really appreciated each other. And when that little first visit was over, she said, well, if you ever come to New York, come and stay with me. So when I came to New York in the fall of '76, because Real Feelings Film, So Where's My Prince Already, was actually accepted for the second International Festival of Women's Films in New York, and 3 of the 7 or 8 of us in the collective decided to come for that, and I stayed with Nancy. So again, it was a sort of, reuniting of this pretty recent friendship. And I was a young artist. I had only been to New York once for a week, and Nancy was a very generous host and mentor, I would say, and tried to impress upon me various rules of if you want to be successful in the art world, you better go to the Cedar Tavern every night. And I said, well, I don't smoke and I don't like being in smoky rooms. And she was like, well, then you're not going to be well known. I mean, it was just like, these were facts. These were not contestable, you know. But she also took me to parties when she was invited to parties, and so I got to meet a lot of the people who she was friendly with. I got to meet DeeDee. DeeDee was one of the first people I met through Nancy. And Richard Serra and, you know, various other people. Leandro Katz was in that group. And so it was a very big part of my early days as a youngish artist in New York. I was 26 when I moved to New York and realized that it didn't matter what you did anywhere else. Added up to nothing. You could have your own magazine, you could have made films, you could have done whatever you did, meant nothing. You had to start over again in New York. I mean, I think it's changed a little bit, but not a lot. And so not only did I come and stay with her when I came for the festival, which I think was in September, but then I came back a few months later and basically lived with her until I got my own place, which was 2 or 3 blocks from where she lived in the West Village. And, you know, so we kept our conversation going. And because I had this art magazine that I had started in Vancouver, I would go back to Vancouver every few months to do another issue. And at one of those times, Nancy said, would you, you know, stop off in Salt Lake City and interview me in sun tunnels. And so I brought whatever the little cassette recorder was and interviewed her in sun tunnels. And of course we also got lost going on a walk, which it was my first experience in the desert, and I have to say I was completely terrified because the idea that you look all around you and it all looks the same, and you think you know where you were, like you think you know where you left the hat, but there is no way that you could know. And we got lost, and it was in the days before people carried water around. And I remember just having this, you know, sort of panic thought at a certain point, like, oh my God, we could be in the desert all night. We don't have water. We don't know where the car was or anything. But on that trip to meet her, to go see sun tunnels, we stayed in the little town nearby and drank at the Cowboy Bar, and she introduced me to all her friends, including the old prospector who I think had a secret crush on her. I think a lot of people had kind of secret crushes on her because she was such an unusual person to be, you know, really fully engaging with these people who really didn't know city people or see city people, and she was very committed to them and interested in their lives. There was some, I think I've told you this, there was some woman who was dancing half naked on the bar that night, whose husband called the bartender to say, like, is my wife there? Yes, she is. And, you know, I mean, it was very, like, colorful. And then I interviewed her in sun tunnels, and I went back to Vancouver and I carefully transcribed all of that long article, which is in the archive that Lisa kindly sent me a copy of, which I hadn't seen since the 70s, and which I remembered was typed on onion skin paper so as to be you know, thin and not cost a lot to mail to Nancy in New York. And we had many conversations, including in New York, about, subjects like feminism and how to be successful in the art world, and just even about galleries. I mean, she was very, like many people that were in her sphere, really kind of against the gallery system and didn't really want to show there, didn't even really want to show documentation when it was asked for. Really had a very radical idea of what art might be, what it should be, what it could be, what we needed to fight for it to be. And so that was how we came to know each other.
And in fact, this interview that Ardele's talking about is incredibly significant. So it's long. And then subsequent to the interview with Ardele, Nancy Holt repurposed it to turn it into a self-interview. And what does it mean when an artist does a self-interview? It means they're asking themselves what they want to be asked. And then she repurposed it a third time. It's really a kind of trio of lives your interview had, to turn it into the 1977 text that was published in Art Forum magazine. And at each level, it becomes more formal. So with your conversation, you two are debating, otherwise known as arguing, about feminism, about the art world, about positions. And then the next version is very much a polemical self-interview. And then the Art Forum article is polite in some ways.
Right.
But it's a real indication of that deep thought that Nancy Holt went through, researching, thinking, reiterating. But your story, Ardele, really communicates her generosity and connection to people. And Rebecca's very beautiful introduction to DeeDee used a phrase that I think is really, really important in describing DeeDee, that DeeDee and Nancy were best friends. It's a phrase that we often use when we're children, when you are inseparable from someone. But as we become adults, that idea of the best friend is something even more. It's someone who you can trust, who's chosen family, which is, I think, the greatest honor that anyone can ever have. And I'll never forget when I was first discussing being terrifyingly the first executive director of Holt Smithson Foundation, DeeDee called me up and said, I was her best friend. What are you going to do about that? And I kind of feel that what we try and do at Holt Smithson Foundation is honor that generosity. And DeeDee, I wonder if you could share with us your first connections with Nancy and what begun as a casual meeting became a work, thinking, sharing relationship.
Well, I want to thank this incredible community who put together. It's very touching for me to see. Nancy would really have been very happy.
She would.
She would, and particularly she really did feel. Well, the shows that she put together that Alina so beautifully put together were mostly in universities, and she felt that was the right place. She really did not want to be in a gallery, and I think she would feel so at home here, and the fact that her grandfather taught here, I mean, whoa. And the exhibit is so beautiful. It's very moving to me. I met her right after Smithson died. I never met Smithson, but there was a kind of party afterwards that Virginia Dwan had done, and I didn't go to Virginia Dwan's, but everybody who went to Virginia Dwan's ended up at this transvestite bar afterwards, sort of to let loose all their feelings. Virginia Dwan had the serious funeral, and then everybody felt like letting their hair down or put their hair on. I don't know. it was, and Nancy and I had never been there, and I don't think Nancy had been there either, but apparently Smithson had been there. And we sort of sat together, and there were a lot of people dancing, and I didn't feel like dancing, and neither did Nancy, and she said, I guess we're the wallflowers. So that became a kind of internal joke with us. We called ourselves the wallflowers, sort of. But I didn't know you were lost in the desert because Nancy took me lost in the desert. And she didn't learn. What year would that have been?
That was 76, I think.
Because it was definitely 76 because I was out in Portland with Richard Serra. We had gone to shoot Railroad Turn Bridge, which if any of you haven't seen, it's a really beautiful film. There's a terrible version of it up on YouTube, but tried to see it projected. It's gorgeous. And we'd filmed there, and then we had agreed, Nancy had asked us to stop by and see sun tunnels. So on the way back from Portland, and I know it was the 4th of July, because we were arrested because they thought we were blowing up the railroad. And we somehow got out of that, but we stopped at sun tunnels and slept in the tunnels, each one in a different tunnel. And Nancy had brought blankets and sleeping bags and stuff. And in the morning, it was very beautiful, and Nancy said, before we have breakfast, let's go, and I'll show you this land that I have. So we went to visit the so-called land, and which is still owned by the foundation. So, and we got up, and we didn't have any water. There was water in the car, but we got out of the car. And we weren't really dressed for the desert. I had like a sleeveless shirt and a tank top, and we started walking, and Nancy kept saying, just if we get up there, then you could see the whole thing, and we kept walking. And all of a sudden, we couldn't see the car anymore. And it was very early, so at first it wasn't hot at all, and it kept getting hotter and hotter, and we were terrified. And Richard was terrified. If you've ever seen Richard terrified, he was angry at Nancy. Why did you bring us here? Don't you even know where your car is, And we finally made our way up, but it was several hours, and Nancy was very sick. We took her to the emergency room, actually, and her lips were black. So never go to the desert with Nancy. But I want to read this thing because I was very challenged to come here, and I very much appreciate your inviting me and all the work that everybody has done. But I wanted to really do a real talk, so hold on. It's not that long, it's 2 pages. So, rereading the text in the quite wonderfully heroic and inclusive book that Alina made for the Sightlines exhibition in 2017, I was struck by a lexicon of words that Nancy used to describe not just Spinwinder, but New England in general. She even mentions Melville and Ryder, Albert Pinkin, that is, whose exhibit recently closed at the Whaling Museum. It was smashing, lovely exhibit in New Bedford. Nancy's words in the writing part of the book that Alina did veer from nostalgic bobbing buoys and bramble roses to restored historical districts. She sort of has this string of words that include things like that. And crowded nursing homes. It's like a little essay she did that's just words that remind her of New England. Nancy's traveling exhibit and catalog, which Alina so brilliantly organized, is called Sightlines, but Spinwinder is not really about sight. There are no locators, no circles of light. However, there are aspects resonant to Nancy's early work. For example, the complex geometrical structure, which is so lovely in that little maquette that's there, is tangentially similar to her system sculpture pieces, which are also here, so lovely, that trace either electricity lines or pipes carrying oil or water. There's a second similarity to another work of Nancy's, and that is that this sculpture contains beneath the soil a hidden history, buried weaving tools. That mystery reminds me of Nancy's buried poems. Spinwinder is interactive, a term that also describes two sculptures that Nancy made in southern Connecticut and in Austin, Texas. In those pieces, instead of directing the viewer through a locator or a tunnel, there are circular grates which a visitor can turn and tilt, becoming an active viewer, changing the view and changing the resulting shadows within limitations. Spinwinder's interaction is even more limited, perhaps in the sort of way a mill worker is constrained by the demands of industrial capital. I highly recommend going to visit the piece in southern Connecticut. Or western Connecticut, I guess it is, but it's Lisa and I were able to visit there. It's spectacular. I think it doesn't really photograph very well. It's really an interesting piece. Nancy's life is measured by loss. Her mother at an early age, her husband in the prime of his life, her good friend Dennis, and the death of her last relative, New Bedford resident Aunt Ethel. In this work, the Spinwinder, situated in the neighborhood of her last relative, she could not help but be reminded of her own mortality through the trajectory of her life and the life of her forefather, Samuel Holt, who taught in this region in the technical school. Nancy herself had begun her work life as a teacher in the community school in New York City, which was founded by Norman Studer, a pioneer progressive educator and a promoter of local history and culture in the Catskills, where he founded a children's camp. Spinwinder is really an homage to teaching and her grandfather and his craft. The community school, Norm Studer, and Nancy told me he was a major influence on her. He was a very important progressive educator, and he is well known because the camp that he had was where Pete Seeger first was known. It's called Camp Woodland. Nancy was an assiduous researcher with a diverse collection of books. She showed me a copy, and I brought one here, of Jacquard's Web, and I went out promptly and bought my own copy, which you can peruse if you'd like to see. It's a really interesting book it's like a bio, a kind of pop bio of the French inventor Jacquard, who in 1800, which was right at the very beginning of the 19th century, he created a way to make, and more important, to reproduce extremely complex designs in woven silk, an example of which is out there, which you think is like an etching. It's not an etching. It's like tiny threads of silk, and only the reason that in the past they were making, before jacquard, they were making these complex designs by having what they call draw boys lift tiny individual layers of silk so that the shuttle could go through. And this invention allowed textile designers to make those tiny, those very, very complex designs. Make sure I have the right page. However, one of the things that I learned, I have a friend who's a weaver, and she said that actually the first card, these were with cards. She said the first card weaving was actually developed in Egypt and in Croatia. And what he did was basically make a kind of a much more complicated version of that. And I said in the framed sample that we see there hung in Nancy's bathroom and was something that she looked at every day. It was a weave of tiny silken threads portraying bewigged gentlemen and ladies dancing on a parquet floor, incredibly detailed down to individual hairs on the wigs. We assumed it was used in class to show how fine silk weaving could be made and be reproduced using jacquards, using this punch card system to enable specific sequences of threads to rise up. Jacquard's invention is credited as leading directly to the invention of the computer. It certainly eliminated the meticulous work of the draw boys. No matter how much computers eliminate tedious computation processes or scan infinite data collections, no matter how streamlined and efficient the driverless cars and 3D printers, there are ultimately human beings who have the ideas, who tell the story, who do the coding that makes those inventions possible. All mechanical and digital machines are still reliant on human creativity. And another writer that I admire and found useful in thinking about Nancy was Louis Mumford, a philosopher of technology. The book that this comes from is Techniques in Civilization, and this is a quote: "The machine itself makes no demands and holds out no promises. It is the human spirit that makes demands and keeps promises." Nancy's spinwinder is a promise to her grandfather, a memorial to the doomed looms of the river valleys of New England. It is a memorial to the hundreds and thousands of people who made and depended on the rivers, on the machines, and on the threads of this historic crafts. Nancy's piece demands that we remember that history and the function of both the machines and the workers.
DeeDee, thank you. That's just wonderful, and I think the way that you're talking about the importance of human beings within technology really underlines a part of Nancy Holt's interest in systems. So Melissa said in a very erudite paper this morning that there is no outside of a system, yet systems are something that we weave ourselves through, to continue this metaphor that you're using. And Ardele, I'd really like to learn from you about this trip in November 1978, when you came to see Aunt Ethel. And your words, DeeDee, and all the words that we've had already today, make me keep on thinking that really Underscan and Ransacked is an incredibly complicated work. It's not only about the family member. It's about that family member within the system of society. Within the system of society, who gets left behind? The people who have economic disenfranchisement. Women, again and again. Older women, again and again. And she's putting front and center this relative's life. And that amazing wisdom that retrospect gives us, that we can analyze this. But you were there at the start, Ardele, traveling with her.
Yeah. I mean, you know, she asked me if I would go with her, and I didn't have a 9-to-5 job or anything, so it was something I could do. And all she had told me really was that the lawyer, your father, had called her and said that he had changed Aunt Ethel's will, I think like in the previous day or two, because her caretaker, Pat, the notorious Pat from Ransack, had come in with her, or maybe he'd come to the house, I don't quite remember, but that the will had been changed, and he was a little alarmed, and he really recommended that Nancy come and see for herself what was going on. So, I mean, having never been to, at that point, to New Bedford, having certainly never been to the family house on Locust, I had no idea what to expect. And of course, I had never really witnessed elder abuse. I'd really never been in these big, drafty, old New England homes that had so many rooms, you know, so I came very underprepared for what we were to see. And the instructions were, act like you're just in the neighborhood, and you're just passing by and you want to say hi to Aunt Ethel. I mean, so I just thought that's what our job was. Hi, we're in the neighborhood. We want to say hi to Aunt Ethel. And, you know, it was very clear from the moment we got in the house that things were not as they should have been. There was a lot of commotion, people moving around, trying to get out of the way, not be seen. Everything was filthy and dark. There was all kinds of opened jars and things of food everywhere. And what Nancy had asked me to do was kind of, as I recall, like be the front person, because she had her camera with her, a 35mm camera, and she wanted to be snapping pictures. So I was, you know, asked to kind of be the one like going ahead, so she wouldn't be really noticed snapping the pictures. So, you know, we were taken into where Aunt Ethel was, a shriveled older woman in the dark with like a very small, maybe 10-inch black and white TV, sitting on a hardback chair, literally just zoned into the screen. And clearly that was a way that Aunt Ethel could, in a sense, lose herself to the horrors that were going on around her. As Nancy mentions in the text, which I had not seen for a really long time, so just earlier I was going frame by frame and rereading it. And she says that whenever Pat wasn't in the room, because clearly she was on a mission to try and, you know, remove whatever was extremely problematic, this guy Angel would come and stand in the doorway to like keep an eye on us. And also we had been instructed by the lawyer to say that we wanted to come and pick up Aunt Ethel the next morning at 11:30 and take her to lunch, and could they have her ready. So this was our sort of like parting you know, threat, as it were. And we left, and we were just completely mortified. The bathroom was disgusting. Everything was disgusting. I did remember, you know, that there were some paintings on the wall, and Nancy mentions in the text that they were her grandfather's, and they were slashed. And DeeDee and I drove by there today, and I did remember the shape of the house and how big it was and where the entrance to the kitchen was, but I didn't see it in the light, or maybe there's something about the memory of that experience which was all about the dark. It was just about dark. And then, you know, my memory was that we stayed at your house, at the lawyer's family's house, and then the plan was that we would go at 11:30 in the morning, pick up Aunt Ethel, take her out of the house, which at least would be a temporary kind of, you know, reprieve from this nightmare that she was clearly forced to live in. And then the plan was that while we were at lunch, somebody would call the house, call Pat, and say that Aunt Ethel needed help at the hospital or the doctor, and we were going to take her there, thereby giving some more time to whatever the legal, you know, strategy was going to be to try and, I guess, either arrest these people or detain them, or, you know, I'm not entirely clear about that. But when we were driving Aunt Ethel, I do remember we were asking her questions when we were on the way to lunch about how she was being treated. First of all, she was dressed very poorly. I mean, like practically wearing a robe to go to lunch. And I think she had like maybe one raincoat left. And it was November, it was cold, so, you know, she wasn't really well enough dressed. But they had clearly sold pretty much everything that Aunt Ethel had, and this is what she was left with. And Aunt Ethel wouldn't say a bad word about her caretaker. She was clearly afraid for her life if she'd said anything against them. So it took a while, took well into the lunch, to get her to say anything that was the least bit critical or true about her situation. And then I think that, and I'm not 100% sure of the sort of immediate sequence of events, but I do know that Pat had tickets already bought to go to Puerto Rico. They were sort of stopped before they could go, and Ethel was put in a nursing home, and I guess the house was sold, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was really the first time that I'd ever seen anything, you know, that terrifying to me. I think like many older people then and now, there's such a great fear of going into a nursing home, which is another system, and certainly a part of the system of medical care, or that kind of horrible place where capitalism and medical care meet. And there is a lot of, as we all know, elder abuse and a lack of appropriate care that goes on in some of those facilities that has been highlighted particularly during COVID, right? So I totally understand Aunt Ethel's fear of going into a home, and Nancy wanting to support her to be able to live in her home as long as she could. So I know that Nancy came up here again in December, and I can't remember whether I came with her or not. She says in the text that she came with a friend. I can't tell you for sure whether that was me or not. It may have been. My ex-husband said he thought it was more than one trip. But just that whole story, I mean, it reverberated then and now.
And maybe even more now with COVID.
Yeah.
know, so.
I mean, and then when I watched Underscan recently, because Lisa very kindly made that available to me, I was so, because I hadn't seen that since the 70s, and I was so taken by Aunt Ethel as really a representative of this type of woman who is alone. She cared for her parents, I think, which was, I mean, she did get married at least twice, but clearly didn't have children of her own, and found herself in this big old house trying to get roomers, which were people who rented rooms, and I knew that from my grandmother who had roomers. And as time went on, there were fewer and fewer people who would rent the rooms, and in the audio track to Underscan, that's Aunt Ethel talking about there are no more roomers. So, you know, we have this sense of community. I mean, it's very fragile. I think COVID has really also brought that home to us.
I think that's right, and in a way we've got another sense of community, of everyone coming together here.
Right.
Eden has given me the signal more than once that it's time to come to a close. I don't know if we have time for questions, at all.
Okay, great.
And of course we can talk more informally by popping back into the gallery, but I wonder if anyone has maybe one short, concise question.
Will we allow one medium-length question?
Or a comment, whatever.
Or a comment. I mean, maybe just while people are thinking. Sorry. Go.
So I read an article that talked about Nancy's expanding idea of land art and land as art. Can you talk about that a little bit? Are you familiar with like the reason why she was taking people out into the desert was to show them the land that she had bought?
It's a really nice question, but it's also the opening to a set of answers that, can we have a couple more hours maybe to address this? But not to close it down, to bring it back to the topic today. Perhaps this sense of land art isn't always so useful for Nancy Holt, because she has such an expansive practice. She wasn't an artist who, in a very, I can't think of a better word, please forgive me for using this word, in a very kind of settling way of possessing landscape. She observed, as we've learned today, and looked and encouraged us to think about what was around us. And maybe the story that Ardele, incredibly moving story you've just told of that trip, it's about Nancy looking at a sense of place, thinking about how sight, individuals, systems, actions, and memories really come to build a set of society. It's grounded work, and today we've had the great honor of having ideas grounded by these two incredible brains I'm sitting next to.
I would say also that it was a little bit about, I think a little bit about her sense of displaced home, and where is home? Where can home be? You know, what can be home? Can this vast expanse of desert be home? I mean, I think a lot of that, especially when I see those old works like Underscan and even my personal experience with Ransack, it's like she didn't have a home after that. When Aunt Ethel's home was trashed by these horrible people, there was really nothing left. You know, and I think there was a kind of seeking elsewhere for that.
And maybe that makes today even more resonant, that perhaps Nancy Holt's home was her ideas and her work, and days like today and the conversations that are going to reverberate and spark out of this particular day will keep that spirit. So there are so many people to thank, but maybe we should prioritize one person. We should thank Nancy Holt for bringing to us ideas and possibilities of rethinking our conduct and our place in the world. So thank you to Nancy, and thank you to Ardele and DeeDee.
And to you too, Nancy.